Hello, welcome to Mr. Smith History, and it's an online look at the opposition to the Vietnam War. So this will feed into what you've already looked at in terms of the war itself. And what we're looking at here is how the people in America were looking at Vietnam and how they gradually turned against it. So we're just going to take a look at the bigger picture and just put a little bit of context to what we're looking at today. So approximately 2.8 million soldiers fought in Vietnam, and I've represented them there by there. There's approximately 2.8 million heads there. Now, because there were so many people involved in it, it had a huge impact on virtually everyone in the country. And as time went on, and especially when you get to the late 1960s, support for the war starts to wane. We've got things that happen like the Tet Offensive, which you can go and have a look at yourselves. We'll touch on it briefly. And a huge amount of money, about 20 billion a year, being spent, and people are starting to wonder why we are fighting this war on the other side of the world. Also, remember, this is in the age of television, so this is one of the first wars which was broadcast, back home to the nation, and it wasn't, it wasn't sanitized like we get today. So people were seeing the Vietnam War in America in all its gory details, and people started to turn against it. So we're going to be having a look at some of the groups today that sort of turned against the war. So the first task you're going to do is the Cornell note-taking task. So I'm going to go through a number of different groups who were opposed to the Vietnam War, and I want you to use the Cornell note sheets that I put in the Google Classroom to make notes on these different groups. If you're not part of the Google Classroom, I will put a link below us to show you where you can get these documents. So if you're not familiar with the Cornell note-taking, you'll see we've got subheadings on the left-hand side of the sheet. For example, at the top there, we've got student protest. And what you need to do is, when I'm giving you information about the student protest and the lined bit next to it, that's where you need to make notes about the student protests. Then when we move on to the next section, for example, the pacifists, you need to make your notes in the pacifist section. You want to be looking for key names, key points, key dates. Keep it concise. You don't need to write everything down that I'm saying. You'll also notice at the top there we've got a bit for general information, so you might want to go back to the start of the video and just make notes on your Cornell sheet about the sort of the information I was giving you there for the bigger picture of Vietnam. So students were one of the key groups that protested against the war. In April 1965, 20,000 people went to Washington to protest at the Washington Monument, and this was led by a group known as Students for Democratic Society. As time goes on, these protests grew more and more and more, and actually they became more likely to become violent. And sometimes at these events they would even burn the American flag, the Stars and Stripes, and of course this is an arrestable offence in America. The problems increased further, and in 1974 students at Kent State University were shot dead by the US National Guard. Look at that little fella go. There he is, running around there, and there he is, settled there. Well done. So we're looking at pacifists here, and that was, of course, there's a dove. Doves was the name that was given to people who were anti-war. If you were pro-war, you would be called a hawk. And many believed, obviously the pacifist believes, that the war was morally wrong. And to sort of go against this, along with the students, there was mass demonstrations, massive protest movement, and this included a huge march in Washington in December 1969. Coupled with this, you've got, with him tied into popular culture, you've got singers writing anti-war songs, songs that were specifically criticising Vietnam itself. Bob Dylan wrote Masters of War, and John Lennon wrote Give Peace a Chance. So in terms of the media, this was the first time that it was a fully televised war. Journalists were on the ground with troops, and they were filming, recording, interviewing, and all this was going back to America and being fed back into the public. It was vividly reported by these journalists who were in search of stories. And what this meant was, because the war was not sanitized, as I said earlier, because everything that was getting sent back was then being banged out onto television, the images that were being seen of innocent civilians being killed, people being maimed, people being tortured, was something that was horrifying the American public, and this obviously turned them against the war. So what was the draft in draft dodging? Well, the draft was conscription. So this was when American men were forced into joining the US Army, and this lasted from 1954 to 1975. So over time, you've got families where people, like sons, brothers, fathers, everyone, are being taken to war, and people began to question whether it was worth it. The draft law hit African Americans hardest, incidentally. So many middle-class Americans opposed the war because by 1967 the death rate had increased to 160 per week, and people were actively avoiding the draft. So the draft was like a lottery, and your name was, if you were within a certain age or whatever, was picked out randomly, and people would receive letters, and people were burning these letters in protest to avoid going to the war and in protest against the war. So remember, the Vietnam War came in the 1950s, 1960s, and this was the height of the civil rights movement in America. So you've got people who were opposing the war, who were also civil rights activists, and they were fighting for more rights, in particular for African Americans in the USA. Many African Americans were drafted, as I said on the previous page, because they were new recruits. They were often given the worst postings and given the worst assignments. So the percentage of black Americans compared to white Americans who were drafted was much higher. Famously, Muhammad Ali had his boxing title revoked because he refused to go and fight in the war, and he was imprisoned. Okay, what I want you to do now is pause the video, and using the different groups that we've looked at there, I want you to rank them in order of which group is the most important in terms of protest against the Vietnam War. So which group do you think would have had the biggest impact? Which group do you think was, the most important? Then, once you've sorted them into order, I want you to write a P paragraph explaining your top choice. So why do you think the group that you've chosen was the most important? Give your reasons for it. Just before we go into the final task, there's some further learning that you may or may not be interested in looking into. The Tet Offensive, which was vital in turning public support in America against the war. This was an attack by the North on the South. We got the Hard Hat Riots, which are kind of the antithesis of the student protests. The My Lai Massacre, which will come up in the next task, which was a rather brutal affair by American troops, and the controversial use of chemical weapons. So, if you want to delve a bit deeper into Vietnam, you do go to look at these types of things. Next, I want you to use the sheet that you've been given there with the information on, and I want you to use those facts and the information that you've already been given to create a mind map or categorize them in whatever way you want of the different reasons why people protested against the Vietnam War. You can do it in whatever way you want. I've got an example coming up on the next slide of how you might want to do it. So here we've got a mind map and the various categories that you could put the information under. We've got the death toll, the student contribution, the My Lai Massacre that I mentioned previously, and chemical weapons, the draft, and the media. Yeah, you can use this as a template, or you can do it however you want. Well, that's it from me. I hope you're all looking after yourself and keeping safe. Big shout out obviously to PAL and LHA. I couldn't have done this without you. Look after yourselves, and we'll speak to you soon. Goodbye.
Thank you for watching Mr. Smith History.